I am now at lecture 2 of the Trumbo lectures, and this one is called Lazarus Alive, and you'll see why that is so. And here are the 6 points I'm going to talk about. Beding, I'll put those up. And you'll see the first one is whose war is it anyway? And I ended the last lecture by suggesting essentially that until he goes to war and is irretrievably damaged beyond, well, apparently beyond repair, but this is not true, Joe has chosen not to choose his politics, which is in itself a choice, okay? I mean, that is, choosing not to choose is a choice. The issue is whether or not you're aware of it. My experience with people, if people ask me, say, what do you do? And if I say I'm a teacher, which I often do, and I don't, yeah, I just say I'm a teacher. And then they'll say, we'll get into a discussion. If we actually are going to have a discussion, we'll get into a discussion about something. And if I say, well, but what about this? If I ask some political question, they'll say, oh, I don't know about that. I'm like, well, has anybody ever asked them that before? Probably. I mean, I hope that the school system, this is where you rely on the school system to do this, right? But at the same time, we know that the school system is set up to train and socialize people to sit down and shut up and do their jobs, basically, because you have to get people ready to go and take sucktastic jobs, which are not going to be great for them and are going to be, yeah, it's just not going to be fulfilling and not going to be pleasurable and not going to be, it is not going to be work that you can particularly believe in because it's going to be crap work. And most of the population is going to do crap work. So, not pretty by choice. They're just going to, like, that's what they've got to work. Okay. So once Joe is bombed into sensibility, he becomes aware. This is the point. I mean, he becomes sensible. That is, as he loses all his senses, he gains his, what we would say, his senses. He comes to his senses. It's an interesting thing, right? We talk about coming to your senses, which presumably means getting in touch with where you are, what your bodily situation is. Well, he's in touch with that, right? And there's this at the beginning of the novel, because he's in such a vortex of chaos, of horror and trauma. He's got this sort of ticker tape running through his head. On page 36, he says, and their lives, if necessary, that democracy may not perish from the face of the earth. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. Don't get scared, Corrine. It's all right. And the great patriot Patrick Henry said, Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. And this is one of many pieces of streams of consciousness that Trumbo puts in. And people complained about the book and said it was too artsy, or it was too pretentious, or these streams of consciousness were too self-indulgent and so on. I think it really works. And to me, it looks like a sort of ticker that's running through his head. And because he cannot stabilize it yet, he has not been able to. He's in too much pain. He's just so freaked out and in too much distress. And it's amazing that he ever comes to consciousness. Essentially, that we have to. I mean, it's all fiction, right? But that the character comes to consciousness. And so if you look back and see, like, okay, what's this made of? It's like, okay, so it's pieces of sort of political speech, literally political speech, the speech given by politicians. So he says, in their lives, if necessary, the democracy. So it's sort of this, it just comes in on the end of a typical, people will, men will fight for their country and give their lives if necessary, and so on. And then there's a little piece of a song, right? It's a long way to Tipperary, which was a enormously popular British song. Tipperary is actually in Ireland, but this became the sort of like thinking of home. It was the song about home, and then we've got Joe remembering himself, consoling Karine or reassuring her that it's all right. And then we get more sort of political speeches, as that great patriot Patrick Henry said. And Patrick Henry, you probably remember you will remember this quotation or know this quotation, even if you don't know it was Patrick Henry, said, I have no care for others, but as for myself, give me liberty or give me death, right? And that's the famous sort of statement from the American Revolutionary War. And so, as Patrick Henry said, and then Johnny Get Your Gun, and Johnny Get Your Gun is a song, it's a popular song. It's not, Long Range Tipperary sort of became almost like a folk song. It sort of became an anthem for the troops. But Johnny Get Your Gun is not. It's a war song. So they're very different. So there's sort of stream of consciousness where Trumbo stitches everything together. And so whose war is this? And because none of this has much Joe in it, the only part that's Joe is him reassuring Karine that, he's not going to get killed. We know how that works out, right? And so what I'm talking about now effectively is myth and how it works, because the soldiers will come to believe that this is their war. Well, is it their war? I mean, who owns the war? And this is a huge debate, as you can imagine. Does the state own the state that goes to war? Does it own the war? What about the two or three or four states? In this case, with the Triple Entente, we've got 6 different nations involved. Just the whole, the huge, and with World War One, it is a world war. So, massive numbers of countries, coming together and clashing in all kinds of different ways all over the globe because of these different alliances. And all of them sort of apparently kind of meaningless. It's just these are agreements that they agreed to go to war if so-and-so went to war, or they agreed to go to war. So who owns the war? Is it the soldiers who own it? Is it the states who own it? The nations that make it? Is it the victims? Is it the dead? Is it the civilians at home who survive it? Who owns this war? And this is, it's interesting. If you ask people on Remembrance Day, it would be interesting to ask this question. Remembrance Day is not generally a good time to ask people questions like that because it really pisses them off. Which I think is actually a good idea. I think it's a good idea if people get pissed off on Remembrance Day. You can get them out of their, because they're so in love with having a good old cry. People want to go to the cenotaph or whatever it is and have a good cry about, how bad things have been for Jesus Christ. Anyway. No Remembrance Day ever stopped a war, boy. And so we're into this territory of mythos, where maybe it's maybe the war takes on its own mythic reality, and this is something which he mentions, and this is a famous story that was told on page 23. He puts it in the LA newspapers. Carried a story of 2 young Canadian soldiers who had been crucified by Germans in full view of their comrades across no man's land. Now this never happened. There was never a trench crucifixion, but everybody knew the story, and everybody knew somebody. It's like the friend of a friend. This stuff like the what do they call that? Urban legends, where everybody knows somebody who saw the thing happen, but nobody actually saw it themselves. So there was no trench crucifixion. The Germans had exactly the same story. They were like, yep, a German had been crucified in full view of the German lines by Americans or by British or by Canadians. They had everybody doing it. The French, those crazy French, crucifying a Bosch. Everybody had this story. War critic Paul Fussell calls this one of the finest, he says, the finest myths of the war. This supposed trench crucifixion, and he also has there's another myth that Fussell will talk about, and I will come to it. But then, and this is the rage that takes Joe when he's lying on his bed, of course, because he doesn't have any option, and the generals come in and they pin something on him, and he's like, "What are they doing?" And he realizes they're giving him a medal. And then he is enraged. And he can't do anything about it. 3 or 4 glib guys, famous guys who still had arms and legs and who could see and talk and smell and taste, had come into his room and they'd pinned a medal on him. They could afford to, couldn't they? The dirty bastards on 160. I have to say. It's like, right on. And you'll see scenes like this. You'll see it in file footage. You'll see it in newsreel footage because it was the kind of thing that was filmed in hospitals, where you'll have grievously wounded men, who were burned. They actually, in Patton, which I think is really a good war film. I mean, I would see it because it's just a very clear picture of how crazy these fuckers were, and still are, and how much we adore them. And I think that's the beautiful thing about Patton. And I think that's what George C. Scott, I think that's why he took the role. I think he understood that this was a way to get at the insanity of war. But at the same time, people loved it because they were like, that's our hero. And then they tried to give him the Academy Award for it. He wouldn't take it. Of course, because he knew what it meant. In the middle of 1970, I think it was 70. Yeah, it was 1970. He knew what it meant. If he accepted it, it meant that Vietnam was fine. It was okay. So he wasn't going to take that. And that was kind of the end of George C. Scott's career, I think. He went on working, but anyway. So each war, you will be told, is important for democracy, and I have now heard this 4 times in my life, and not one single instance has it been true. So, I gotta stop there.